Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the leaked revelations that the government have been interfering in the decisions on where local lockdowns occur in order to favour, as they would see it, conservative backing areas of the country, particularly the wealthier areas and the new conservative areas. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, who knew, right? The Conservative government applies rules inconsistently to favour their own. Shock of the century, yes I know. And of course this news isn't shocking in itself either, because when the local lockdowns really started being rolled around England, I said at the time that this is a bit odd because they seem to be hitting a lot of Labour areas harder and for longer, not really seeing much in the way of Conservative areas being clobbered by this. It was no surprise at all for me to see a lot of these lockdowns take place in the north of England, because it was believed at the time that we came out of our national lockdown that although the R rate was believed to be lower across the country, because it had been, different phases at different parts of the country, it was believed that in the north of England it was actually still rising. So it was still rising in the north of England, then we eased the lockdown restrictions, we came out of them. So obviously that was going to carry on accelerating up. So yeah, the fact that you saw a lot of them in the north of England, that is, didn't surprise me. But there are now a lot of conservative areas in the north of England. And these places didn't seem to be figuring in the areas hit with the most severe restrictions. And now, I mean, that was just suspicions at the time. I just thought to myself, it's a bit funny, especially as lockdowns weren't instigated by the local authorities, which they should have been. It was all orchestrated from government, central government. But now we have proof of the suspicions, because the Times, which a story like this I would have expected in the Guardian or the Mirror. No, this is the Times. This is a pro-conservative newspaper that, though it's no admirer of Boris Johnson, nonetheless also represents a wealthy readership. There are other pro-conservative papers as well that aren't necessarily pitched towards the wealthier, the more affluent in the country. The Times is levelled at wealthy people. And it reported on leaked emails that show that conservative areas, including the Chancellor Rishi Sunak's constituency, have been spared, as they call it, local restrictions despite having a much higher rate of infection than poorer areas that have faced restrictions. The implications for this concept of basing public health decisions during the most serious healthcare crisis of our lifetimes on politics, fairly horrendous. First of all, it's the classic case of one rule for us and another rule for them. Or more specifically, no rules for them. I noticed that Stanley Johnson, the Prime Minister's father, has, for the third time in a week, been caught not wearing a face mask where he was supposed to be wearing a face mask. My partner was saying, when are they finally actually going to fine him? Never. Will never happen, even though he can easily afford it. I'll tell you what they can't afford. Their ego cannot afford being told that they can't do a thing. So it will never happen. But the fact that you have this scenario, this one rule for them and another rule for us, means that people facing local restrictions are much less likely to follow them now. And for two potential reasons. One, the obvious one, the one that's been discussed ever since, Barnard Castle, the classic case of not wanting to follow rules set by rules makers who don't show enough solidarity to follow them themselves. A do as I say, not as I do attitude. It strikes against our fundamental concept of justice and togetherness. Boris Johnson keeps calling for a spirit of togetherness. Well, where is his? Where are the Conservatives? But that's just one element. The second element, much more serious, I think, particularly with this one. So you now might have some people wondering, so let's say you're in an area that's under local restrictions. It's been under local restrictions for some time. And then you're thinking to yourselves, well, given that the decision to place my area under local restrictions was political, we know that politics means a light touch to conservative areas and a harder one to Labour areas. And maybe some people will think, so the restrictions I'm subject to may not actually be for health reasons. It might be just politics. So they're just being imposed deliberately to make our lives more miserable. That line of thinking inevitably, if you find the restrictions inconvenient, inevitably leads to people using their common sense, British common sense no less, and abandoning the measures designed to suppress infection rates. And this would not be a thought without merit, because at first glance you can look at this news and as I saw it when I quickly read through it before I read through it again, it's simply not applying restrictions to all places that should have them. Because that's what it's saying. It's like, well, all these Labour areas, yeah, they've got the restrictions, but they need them because rate of infection. It's just that the Conservative areas should also have them. They just don't have them. But no, it's worse than that. Because some of the poorer areas that are in local lockdown have infection rates below the benchmark that's supposed to trigger them. So there is strong evidence that there are some places in lockdown just because the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, decided that there was political gain in placing restrictions on it. For example, actual examples. The report, again in the Times, gave the example of, say, Wolverhampton in the Midlands, which has restrictions. It's under local lockdown and it has an infection rate of 56 per 100,000 of the population. But take Barrow-in-Furness, Conservative area. This has a rate of 112 per 100,000. That is double the rate of Wolverhampton, which is in local lockdown. And that is not under any local restrictions. The Department for Health said that the rate of infection was just one factor that determined lockdown decisions. Yeah, we know. The main factor is whether or not it's a Conservative area or not, isn't it, Matt? Secondly, by not applying restrictions in areas with a high rate of infection, what you're doing is helping the virus spread. The purpose of the restrictions, well, okay, it seems now the purpose of the restrictions is political, but it's supposed to be for healthcare reasons. So the purpose is to suppress the virus. But that's not happening in those areas. And those areas aren't walled off. People travel from them and to them. Having even one area not controlled with adequate restrictions and properly monitored when necessary causes the unchecked infection to spill out into surrounding areas as people travel between them. This is literally a case of the government allowing the virus, because they know the implications of this, allowing the virus to spread for political reasons that they barely understand themselves. That's not incompetence. Incompetence is just when you don't have the skills and or wisdom to deal with an issue. This is deliberate. At the very best, you could describe it as political incompetence, because I understand the reasons well enough. If those Conservative areas are placed under local restrictions, what happens? People complain. Who do they complain to? They complain to their Conservative councillors, or they complain to their Conservative MP. That Conservative MP or those Conservative councillors will then put pressure on those, the people will put pressure on those people to moan to the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary. So they buckle. Instead of actually leading the country and getting the message across about how important it is to make these small sacrifices, most of which are barely anything at all for this group of flag shaggers who like to invoke the blitz spirit as often as possible, except when, of course, it's going to be used against them. They abandon their responsibility and just take the path of least resistance to get them through the end of that day. In the short term, it's just short-term thinking, dealing with the long-term consequences later on. And the same report in the Times also gave voice to the concerns of increasing economic inequality, because these political decisions, on who faces restrictions, are inevitably not imposing measures on wealthier areas, such as Boris Johnson's own constituency, for example, which also has a high rate of infection but no restrictions. And it hits harder poorer areas, such as Labour-controlled Manchester, for example. So what happens is you further economically depress those poor areas, because restrictions, of course, means you're also hitting economic activity. That's unfortunately the trade-off. So the poorer areas are being hit with an extra depressed economic activity, sometimes when it's not even required, whilst you allow economic activity to proceed at full tilt in richer areas. So the result is a very predictable widening in the wealth gap between rich and poor. And to add insult to injury, you can also see what the Conservatives will inevitably do when this is all over, which of course will take much longer due to these brainless acts. they will point out, they'll look at it afterwards and they'll go, oh, you see those Labour areas, those Labour-controlled areas, they seem to fare less well. They were under restrictions for much longer than the Conservative ones, and they were economically more depressed than the Conservative ones. That shows that the Conservatives are best at managing the situation. Classic Conservative trick of blaming their own destructive handling of a situation on their opposition. But you might think, hang on, Phil, no, because local councils, MPs, and even elected mayors have no power in this. This has all been controlled by central government, all directed from the Conservative government in London. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But how many people do you think know that? And of those who are now, at the moment, at this point in time, vaguely aware of that fact, how many are going to remember that in a few years' time when it matters, when the election's coming? And so the Conservatives give themselves another political advantage in deliberately making a bad situation worse. Of course, it's not guaranteed to work. You know, so far the general population has been increasingly becoming aware of the failures of the government, thanks to more effective opposition at least. It would be helpful if more people would also look overseas to see how other countries are managing, because they'll see some countries managing it a damn sight better than us. Unfortunately, the only country we ever seem to look at in the UK is the United States. And yeah, the orange one is not exactly helping our cause on that one. But whether the Conservatives actually gain long-term political advantage from this abuse of the people doesn't matter. Seems to me that it's clear that that is their belief, that's their perception. And it'd be easy to see the logic in it. I can absolutely see the logic in it, and I believe that they will as well. The only thing that really gives me any hope at all is that if you look at it, the people that Boris Johnson spends most of his time listening to have not exactly shown themselves to be politically savvy. Consider this. Boris Johnson's approval rating has gone from a high earlier this year of 66%, thinking that he was doing well, and only 26% thinking he was doing badly, to now only 35% think he's doing well, 57% think he's doing badly. He's gone from an approval rating of plus 40 to minus 22 in half a year. And bear in mind that emergencies usually boost the government's approval. People will go, oh, it's just the crisis. The crisis boosts a leader's approval. You know, people naturally rally around their leader when you are facing a threat from outside. No one's saying that this pandemic is Boris Johnson's fault. But it's fairly obvious that the fact that we are doing more badly out of it than others is. National crises often make unpopular leaders popular. That Johnson has suffered a catastrophic polling nosedive is not exactly an indicator that he is getting the best political advice. So we might well find ourselves in a situation where the Conservatives are spreading barely told suffering throughout the land, propagated by a complicit media, and it may well be that they're not even doing themselves any good out of it. Lose-lose for everyone when the final tally of this emergency is made. And that this will be reported in the Times was astounding to me. Sure, wasn't on their front page. That would have been really remarkable. But to report this injustice in a paper that actively promotes inequality of wealth, that was interesting to me. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, when this rain has stopped, I'll see you later.